The morning began with that muted stillness Helena had grown used to, the kind that lingered in the corners of her apartment like an uninvited guest. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint echo of traffic from the coastal avenue, the pale light threading its way through half-closed blinds, all of it created a fragile quiet that felt both comforting and accusatory. She moved slowly through the space, not out of frailty, but out of an instinctive reluctance, as if hurrying would break something delicate inside her. Her hands brushed the surface of the kitchen counter, lingering on the cool texture, grounding her against the heaviness that tended to bloom in her chest before family gatherings. The invitation to lunch had come in the familiar tone of obligation rather than affection. There was always a reason to gather: a birthday, a return trip, a cousin visiting. Today the excuse was vague, simply "vamos nos ver." The message came from her eldest daughter, who often spoke as though managing an employee rather than addressing a mother. Helena had agreed, of course. She always agreed. A part of her still longed for a version of family where she could arrive without bracing herself, where she could speak freely about the man who filled her days with quiet steadiness, and who, inexplicably to them, had chosen her. She dressed with care, selecting a soft blouse whose fabric rested lightly on her shoulders, and a pair of earrings she had bought months before but never worn outside the apartment. As she studied her reflection, she noticed the fine lines around her eyes, gentle reminders of years vivid as, not lost. She did not think of herself as old, tired sometimes, invisibly judged, often, but not old. Still, she knew how they saw her, or rather, how they insisted on seeing her. Someone whose life should be moving toward tranquil resignation. Someone who had no business being adored by a man who still had a surplus of future ahead of him. The restaurant was already buzzing when she arrived. The sound of overlapping conversations, plates clinking, and chairs scraping filled the air with a restless energy. Her family occupied a long table near a window, sunlight illuminating their faces with a clarity she wished were symbolic. As she approached, she felt that familiar tightening in her stomach, a reflex born not of fear, but of anticipation of what was never said, yet always implied. Her daughter greeted her with a quick kiss on the cheek, eyes immediately scanning her expression as though searching for clues. Her son offered a stiff nod, his hand still clutching his phone. Her sister smiled, but the smile had edges, as if shaped by disapproval carefully wrapped in politeness. Helena sat down, smoothing her napkin across her lap, and felt the weight of their glances settle on her like layers of fine dust. The conversation began with the usual updates: work, children, renovations. Helena listened, adding small comments at intervals, trying not to shrink under the sense of being gently monitored. It was always like this, a choreography of concern, judgment, and unspoken curiosity about whether she was still with him. They pretended not to wonder, but the slight pauses, the glances exchanged over plates, the careful avoidance of certain topics revealed everything. At one point, her daughter asked about her week, and Helena felt the opening, a small, fragile doorway where Daniel's name could fit. She mentioned, with natural simplicity, that she had gone for a long walk near the hospital after a routine appointment. The moment the word hospital slipped from her lips, the atmosphere shifted. Not abruptly, but subtly, like a curtain being drawn a few centimeters. Her son's eyes narrowed. Her sister reached for her glass, using the movement to disguise the way she leaned in slightly, as if awaiting a confession. Helena continued, keeping her tone calm, explaining nothing beyond the walk and the appointment. But the images rose in her mind anyway. Daniel's hand brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the way he paused to hear her fully, the warmth in his gaze when he looked at her as though she were not someone defined by years, but by presence. She did not describe these things, of course. They would have twisted them into something unrecognizable. The meal progressed with invisible tension pulsing beneath the chatter. When her sister mentioned a friend who had se complicado with a man years younger, Helena felt the comment land on the table like a poorly disguised warning. Nobody looked at her directly, yet everyone did. She felt their discomfort, their skepticism, the persistent belief that she was participating in something inappropriate, unrealistic, embarrassing for them to explain to others. Helena lifted her gaze and let it rest on each face, not challengingly, not defensively, simply observing. The realization settled quietly inside her. They were so deeply invested in policing her choices that they had forgotten she was the one living through the consequences, the joys, the fears, the discoveries. She was the one rediscovering parts of herself she thought had gone dormant. The irony was sharp. The people who claimed to love her were the ones most determined to shrink her. When the lunch finally ended, she walked back into the sunshine with a measured breath. The light felt different now, touching her skin with a softness that contrasted the hardness of the table she had just left. She felt tired, yes, but also strangely anchored, because beneath the weight of their opinions, there remained a truth they could not unmake. She had chosen her own life, her own rhythm, her own heart. And though their glances tried to redefine her, none of them knew the depth of what she carried, or how fiercely she intended to protect it. The memory of how everything began surfaced in her mind like a tide rising without warning, slow and inevitable. It had started in the most unremarkable way. A quiet morning in the corridor of the rehabilitation wing, where Helena had been waiting for routine results. She remembered the faint scent of eucalyptus lingering in the air, the distant rhythm of machines beeping, and the nervous flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with illness. She had been sitting alone, her fingers tracing the edge of a medical pamphlet, when Daniel appeared for the first time in a way she truly noticed him. He had passed by her many times before, offering kind smiles and polite greetings, but that morning, something in his expression shifted. His gaze lingered a second longer, as if he sensed a tiredness she had not admitted even to herself. There was no spark of romance, no dramatic revelation, just a gentle attentiveness that felt startling in its sincerity. When he approached to ask if she was all right, his voice carried a warmth that disarmed her defenses. She remembered answering too quickly, insisting she was fine, but he remained for a moment, refusing to rush away. Their first conversations were brief, almost shy. He spoke about his patients, not with the arrogance of someone listing achievements, but with the tenderness of someone who understood how fragile people could be. She found herself drawn to that gentleness, to the way he listened without interrupting, to how he made her feel visible in a world that often treated women her age as background noise. He seemed to notice small details, the way she held her purse tightly when she was nervous, the way her eyes drifted toward windows when she needed a moment to breathe. Weeks passed, and their exchanges grew longer, unfolding like pages left in the sun. They began to meet at the small cafe across the street from the hospital, a place with chipped wooden tables and the aroma of freshly ground coffee drifting through the air. Those moments became anchors in her routine, pockets of warmth where she could speak about her life without being reduced to a mother, a divorcee, or a woman past a certain age. Daniel never treated her like a collection of roles. Around him, she felt like a person shaped by lived experience, not limited by it. She was surprised by how naturally laughter returned to her, how lightness crept into her days. There was no abrupt shift, no impulsive decision, just two people slowly learning to inhabit a gentle space together. When he spoke about his own life, the demanding hours at the hospital, the solitude of living alone, the desire to build something meaningful, she realized how much maturity rested beneath his quiet demeanor. He had lived less time than she had, but he carried his years with an intentional calm that often exceeded the restless energy of men twice his age. Yet outside that bubble, the world had its own narrative prepared for them. Her family's reaction arrived like a cold wind through an open door. At first, she tried introducing Daniel's name in subtle ways, the same way one tests the temperature of water before fully stepping in. But the responses were quick, cutting, and coded in condescension. They questioned his intentions before they even understood his character. They assumed she was clinging to vanity, to some desperate need for youth, as though her emotions were incapable of authenticity simply because they did not align with conventional expectations. The earliest criticism came from her sister, who delivered it with a tone of concern that barely concealed her disdain. Then her son began making jokes, not cruel, but dismissive. the kind that reduced Daniel to a stereotype before he had spoken a single word to them. Her daughter tried a different tactic, a rehearsed speech about stability, reputation, and not giving people reasons to talk. That phrase echoed in Helena's mind for days, not because of its moral weight, but because of its emptiness. People would always talk. They always had, no matter what she did. She tried to explain him, to defend him gently, but each attempt met walls built long before she had ever considered loving again. She felt them defining her relationship in terms she did not recognize: irresponsabilidad, fase pasajera, carencia, all of them orbiting around the assumption that she could not possibly be choosing from a place of clarity. It was as if her age made her incapable of her own emotions. Still, when she was with Daniel, all the noise dissolved. There was only the present moment, the subtle grounding of his presence, the way he spoke her name with genuine affection. He brought out a part of her she had thought had been packed away with old photographs and forgotten journals. Not youth, but something deeper, something luminous. They never spoke about the disapproval directly, but he sensed it. He treated the topic with a quiet respect, never demanding explanations, never pressing her to choose. Instead, he offered steadiness, not in words, but in the way he showed up consistently, the way he waited for her without impatience, the way he created space for her to breathe without being overshadowed. It was this quiet devotion, this gentle certainty, that made everything else feel small by comparison. And though no one else understood, she realized that love had not arrived to rescue her from loneliness, nor to rewrite the years carved into her skin. It had come simply to exist beside her, quietly, steadily, unwavering. A love no one else needed to understand for it to be real. The evening light had already begun to fade when Helena stepped into her daughter's house, carrying the familiar mixture of anticipation and resignation that always seemed to accompany family dinners. The living room glowed softly under warm lamps, the kind meant to create comfort, though to her it often felt like a stage prepared for scrutiny. The scent of roasted vegetables drifted through the hallway, mingling with the faint perfume her daughter favored, a fragrance Helena had once gifted her, before things between them became delicate, subtly strained. She removed her coat with deliberate calm, smoothing the fabric as she placed it over the back of a chair. Her daughter approached with a practiced smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes, but suggested the effort behind it. Helena responded with a gentle embrace, sensing the stiffness underneath. From the kitchen, she could hear her son laughing loudly at something on his phone, the sound punctuated by the metallic clink of cutlery. Her sister was already seated at the dining table, leafing through a magazine without truly reading it. The table had been set beautifully, candles flickering inside glass holders, plates arranged with precision, cloth napkins folded neatly. It was a scene meant to project harmony. But Helena knew that beauty could hide sharpness, and tonight, every detail felt like a fragile attempt to create a version of family that existed only in photographs. As everyone gathered, the conversation started lightly, circling harmless topics like weather, errands, and neighborhood gossip. Helena listened, contributing when expected, careful not to attract too much focus. She felt the room studying her even when no one was looking directly at her, as though they were collectively waiting for her to confirm or deny something without being asked. Halfway through the meal, her sister leaned forward, slicing through the calm with a casual remark disguised as curiosity. "E como você tem passado, Helena? Tem se ocupado com o que ultimamente?" Her tone carried the softness of a feather, but the intent of a probe. Helena answered simply, mentioning her afternoon walks, the books she had been reading, and a recent visit to the hospital for routine tests. She said it naturally, without emphasis. But the word hospital settled in the air like dust illuminated by candlelight. Subtle, but instantly noticeable. Her son's cutlery paused midair. Her daughter blinked with a slight tightening of her jaw. Even her sister's fingers froze on the magazine page. It always happened like this. An ordinary detail transformed into a charged possibility. To them, the hospital meant one thing: the proximity of a man 13 years younger, a man who existed like a shadow in their conversations, defined more by their assumptions than by anything he had ever actually done. Helena continued eating with a quiet poise, refusing to fill the silence that followed. She had learned long ago that explaining herself only created more questions. And yet, she could feel their imaginations spinning narratives of their own making, each one less generous than the truth. Her daughter finally broke the tension with a tone that attempted lightness, but stumbled on its own weight. Mãe, você ainda anda conversando com aquele fisioterapeuta? She didn't say his name. She never did. As if naming him would give the relationship legitimacy. Helena set her fork down slowly. Inside, she felt a familiar ache. Not anger, but the exhaustion of being treated like someone incapable of discernment. She didn't answer with defiance. She simply acknowledged that yes, she still saw Daniel, and no, nothing about that was worthy of the alarm they insisted on feeling. Her voice remained steady, as though she were commenting on the weather rather than defending her right to companionship. The reaction was immediate. Her son leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply through his nose. Mãe, a gente só quer o melhor pra você. A sentence polished by tradition, worn down by repetition, and empty of actual curiosity. Her daughter added something about aproveitadores, using the word as if dropping it gently would make it less hurtful. Her sister chimed in with a story about a friend deceived by a younger man, a tale recounted with dramatic pauses, meant to serve as a caution. Helena listened without interrupting, letting their words wash over her like cold rain. Each sentence carried the unspoken accusation that she was naive, misguided, foolish even. None of them asked what she felt. None wondered why she had chosen someone who made her laugh in ways she had not laughed in years. None considered that maybe what she shared with Daniel wasn't a rebellion, but a refuge. At that table, she felt both surrounded and terribly alone. When the meal ended, she helped clear the plates, moving through the kitchen with practiced efficiency. Her daughter tried to soften the evening with affectionate touches, but the effort felt more like damage control than genuine closeness. As Helena stepped outside into the cool night air, she drew a long breath, letting the breeze cool her skin and quiet the storm inside her. She realized something with a clarity that startled her. Their disapproval no longer frightened her. It tired her, yes. It wounded her, undeniably. But it no longer had the power to dictate her choices. She had walked through too much in life to surrender her joy to the opinions of those who judged from a distance. Walking back to her car, she felt the night closing gently around her, a quiet shield against the voices that tried to shrink her. Because beneath all their noise, one thing remained untouched. What she felt for Daniel existed beyond their comprehension. And she would no longer apologize for it. The hospital had always been a place filled with echoes, footsteps bouncing off tiled floors, whispered conversations drifting through half-closed doors, the persistent hum of fluorescent lights casting a clinical glow on everything beneath them. For most people, the building felt cold, impersonal, a reminder of vulnerability. But for Helena, it had become an unexpected haven, not because of the sterile walls or the predictable routines, but because it was the place where Daniel moved with a quiet purpose that softened even the harshest corners. She arrived that afternoon for a follow-up appointment, walking through the automatic doors as a rush of cool air brushed against her skin. The scent of disinfectant enveloped her instantly, mingling with the faint trace of coffee wafting from the small kiosk near the entrance. She checked in at the reception, her fingers brushing the edge of the counter as she handed over her ID. The receptionist smiled politely, accustomed to the endless stream of patients, and directed her to the waiting area. As Helena walked down the corridor, she felt the familiar rhythm of the hospital settle around her, the distant beeping of machines, the soft murmur of nurses discussing charts, the occasional squeak of a stretcher's wheels. She didn't rush. Her pace matched the atmosphere, slow, observant, quietly attentive to the details that most people overlooked. When she reached the rehabilitation wing, she stopped for a moment, watching from a distance. Daniel stood near one of the beds, his posture relaxed yet focused. He was speaking with an older man recovering from surgery, demonstrating an exercise with deliberate care. His movements were calm, precise, almost graceful in their patience. The way he encouraged the patient, without rushing or condescension, revealed a depth of empathy that could not be taught. Helena felt something warm move through her chest, not excitement, but recognition. This was the Daniel she knew in private, steady, considerate, attuned to the pains others tried to hide. A man who didn't perform goodness, but lived it quietly. She remained where she was, leaning lightly against the wall, unwilling to interrupt. There was something grounding about watching him like this, in his own world, unaware of her gaze. It reminded her that what they shared had grown not from grand gestures, but from the accumulation of moments like this, the softness of his voice, the way he listened, the sincerity with which he handled even the most ordinary interactions. When he finally turned and noticed her, his expression shifted subtly. Not a dramatic smile, not a spark, but a gentle brightness that softened the tension around his eyes. He approached with measured steps, wiping his hands on a small towel tucked into his pocket. "You're early," he said softly, though the words themselves mattered less than the ease in his voice. She explained that she preferred arriving ahead of time, that rushing unsettled her. He nodded, as if he already knew. He always seemed to know. Without asking, he guided her to a quieter corner where they could wait for her appointment. They didn't need to talk. The silence between them was never heavy. It had a texture, like warm fabric resting lightly on the shoulders. Helena studied the room while they sat. She noticed a mother soothing a crying child, a nurse adjusting the strap of a wheelchair handle, an elderly woman gripping a purse as though afraid time might steal something from her if she loosened her hold. The hospital held so many stories, each one flickering briefly against her awareness before disappearing into the endless flow of people. She felt Daniel's presence beside her like a quiet anchor, not possessive, not demanding, simply there. His hand rested casually on his knee, fingers tapping lightly in a rhythm he probably didn't even realize he kept. She found comfort in those small, unconscious gestures. Her appointment was brief, just routine follow-up checks. But she felt a subtle unease in her body that she couldn't quite name. She pushed the feeling aside, telling herself it was only fatigue. When she returned to the waiting area, Daniel was still there, reviewing notes on a clipboard. He looked up when she approached, his eyes scanning her face with a perceptiveness that made it impossible to hide anything from him. "Tudo certo?" he asked quietly. She smiled, offering reassurance she hoped was convincing enough. He studied her for another moment, as though weighing the truth behind her expression, then accepted her answer with the kind of trust that did not demand explanations. As they walked toward the exit, she became aware of a few passing glances from staff members. Nothing overt, just quick flickers of curiosity. She wondered how many of them had pieced together the nature of their connection. But unlike her family, no one here seemed invested in judging it. The hospital was too full of human fragility to waste time on narrow opinions. Before she stepped outside, she paused by the glass doors, watching the world beyond. The stretch of sidewalk, the cars rushing by, the shifting sky. Daniel stood beside her, his presence steady and unspoken. In that moment, she realized something quietly profound. The world outside questioned them, doubted them, dismissed them. But inside this building, amid the machines and the murmurs and the steady pulse of care, what they shared felt grounded, unshakable. Here, no one demanded explanations. Here, she could simply exist, and so could he. And perhaps that was why the hospital, despite its cold surfaces, felt more like a sanctuary than any home she had ever known. The first signs arrived quietly, so quietly that Helena mistook them for simple fatigue. A brief wave of dizziness while she folded laundry, a heaviness in her limbs when climbing the stairs to her apartment, a subtle tremor in her hands as she reached for a glass of water. None of these moments felt dramatic enough to be alarming. They felt like the natural consequences of a busy week, a restless night, a mind carrying too much. She told herself the body sometimes whispered, and there was no reason yet to listen. Still, something in her resisted the way those sensations lingered. She noticed that her morning walks, once a peaceful ritual, now left her breathless by the second block. She found herself pausing more frequently, pretending to admire the view, when in truth she was waiting for her heartbeat to settle. She moved slower in the kitchen, not out of choice, but because her balance felt slightly off, like the ground shifted a fraction beneath her feet. She kept these details tucked away, folded neatly inside the private corners of her mind. She refused to give her family new reasons to worry, or worse, to judge. She could imagine their reactions too clearly, comments disguised as concern, warnings about being careful with her age, insinuations that she was pushing herself too much to keep up with someone younger. They would turn her physical discomfort into a narrative about Daniel, and she couldn't bear that. Not again. Daniel, however, noticed almost immediately. He had always been observant, but lately his gaze lingered a moment longer when she stood up too quickly, or when she placed a hand on the wall for balance. He did not mention it at first. He simply adjusted his pace to match hers, offering his arm casually without making her feel dependent. When they walked near the shoreline after one of her appointments, he slowed without calling attention to the way her breath came unevenly. He simply walked beside her, allowing her to dictate the rhythm. It was this quiet understanding that made the fear sharpen inside her, because if Daniel had noticed, then it was real. She could no longer convince herself it was only the aftermath of a stressful month, and yet, she clung to the belief that acknowledging the symptoms would somehow grant them more power. If she didn't say them out loud, maybe they would fade, but bodies rarely negotiate with denial. One afternoon, after a long day of errands, she felt a sudden pressure in her chest, not painful, but unsettling, as if something internal was misaligned. She sat on the edge of her bed, breathing deeply, telling herself it was nothing. When she finally stood, her vision flickered slightly and a wave of nausea rolled through her. She steadied herself with both hands on the nightstand, waiting until the room stopped tilting. She planned to call Daniel but hesitated. She didn't want him to worry, to rearrange his entire day for her. She didn't want to be a burden. The word echoed painfully inside her. Burden. A fear older than her relationship, rooted in years of managing her family's expectations, absorbing their needs, and learning that her own were always secondary. Even now, despite everything Daniel had shown her, the fear remained, that illness would turn love into obligation. So she stayed quiet. The next days unfolded with a mixture of determination and apprehension. She went grocery shopping, but found herself gripping the cart more for stability than convenience. She prepared lunch, but burned the first pan because her mind drifted unexpectedly, leaving her staring at the rising smoke as though it belonged to someone else's life. When she met Daniel for coffee later that week, he watched her closely. Not intrusively, but with a professional eye sharpened by years of seeing people hide their symptoms out of pride or fear. His brow furrowed briefly when she lifted her cup with both hands, as if steadying it. He didn't mention it, but she felt his attention like a soft weight resting on her shoulders. "Did you sleep well?" he asked after a moment. She nodded, avoiding the vulnerability of explaining how she had woken twice in the night, feeling her heartbeat flutter unpredictably. They talked about ordinary things: his long shift, a book she had started reading, the weather turning unpredictable. But beneath the conversation lay the quiet pulse of concern. He leaned back in his chair, observing her with an expression that blended affection and worry. She knew that look. It asked gently, without words, "What are you not telling me?" Helena forced a small smile, hoping to reassure him. He returned the smile, but something in his eyes remained unsettled. Later that evening, as she prepared for bed, she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The soft lighting revealed a paleness she hadn't noticed before, a subtle hollowness beneath her cheekbones. She studied herself with a mixture of tenderness and fear. She did not feel old, but she felt fragile, not in the sense of breaking, but in the sense of something inside her needing attention she didn't want to give. She placed a hand on her chest, breathing slowly, willing her heartbeat to steady. She whispered into the quiet room, not to anyone, not even to herself, but to the fear she carried. Not now. Please, not now. Because she could face their judgment, their whispers, their disapproval. But the idea of facing illness, of becoming someone who required care, who needed help, Felt like the one battle she wasn't prepared to fight. Not when everything felt so newly possible. Not when Daniel had become the one place where she allowed herself to feel whole again. The night began like any other. Quiet, uneventful. The kind of silence that usually lulled Helena into a gentle sleep. She had gone to bed early, hoping that rest might ease the lingering discomfort that had shadowed her days. The apartment was dim, illuminated only by the soft glow of a street lamp slipping through the curtains. She lay still, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, telling herself that tomorrow she would feel better. But the body has its own language, one that refuses to be ignored. She woke abruptly, as though pulled from sleep by an invisible hand. Her chest tightened sharply, a constriction that spread upward into her throat. She tried to inhale, but the breath caught halfway, trembling on the edge of panic. For a moment, she remained frozen, confused, her mind scrambling to understand what was happening. Then the dizziness returned, violent this time, spinning her vision into blurred fragments. She reached instinctively for the lamp, but missed, her fingers brushing the table with a clumsy weakness that frightened her more than the pain itself. She pushed herself upright, but the motion sent a wave of nausea crashing through her. Her skin dampened with cold sweat. The air in the room felt too thin, too distant. She lowered her feet to the floor, trying to steady herself, but her legs trembled beneath her. Each breath came shallow and frantic, as if her lungs had forgotten their rhythm. A faint ringing filled her ears, growing louder with each passing second. She whispered Daniel's name under her breath, not as a plea, but as a grounding thought. The one person who made fear feel smaller. But he wasn't there. She was alone in her apartment, in the fragile darkness that now seemed hostile. Helena reached for her phone, fumbling with trembling fingers. She knew she should call emergency services, but the idea of admitting the severity of her condition felt like crossing a line she wasn't ready to accept. Instead, she tapped her daughter's number, her hand shaking so violently she nearly dropped the device. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. By the time her daughter answered, Helena could barely speak. "Mom? What's wrong? Why are you calling now?" Helena tried to respond, but her voice broke. She forced out fragments. Pedo. No consigo. And the rest dissolved into strained breaths. Her daughter's tone shifted instantly, sharpened by fear. The call ended quickly, replaced by the promise that help was on the way. Helena lowered the phone and leaned against the wall, forcing herself to breathe through the rising panic. She could feel her heartbeat fluttering erratically, like a bird trapped inside her chest. The room tilted again, and she slid down until she was sitting on the floor, knees pulled close, trying to steady the trembling in her body. Minutes stretched into something indistinguishable. The sound of sirens approached in the distance, growing louder, piercing the stillness of her building. The flashing lights cast shifting shadows across her living room as paramedics rushed in. They spoke to her, their voices calm and rehearsed, but she heard only fragments. Hands guided her onto a stretcher, adjusting equipment, checking vitals, moving quickly, but with controlled precision. As they carried her through the hallway, she saw the faces of her neighbors peeking from behind doors, eyes wide, expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. The cold air outside hit her skin like a shock, and for a moment she felt herself drifting, the edges of the world turning soft and indistinct. Inside the ambulance, everything narrowed. Bright lights, the scent of antiseptic, the rhythmic beeping of monitors. One paramedic spoke to her gently, telling her to breathe slowly, to stay awake. She tried, but her thoughts slipped like sand through her fingers. Between brief flickers of awareness, she wondered if she should have told Daniel sooner, if she should have let him share this moment, instead of keeping him at a distance out of fear of becoming a burden. The ambulance sped through the city, sirens slicing through the night. Helena caught fragments of conversation. Arrhythmia, pressure dropping, prepare oxygen, words that floated around her without fully landing. When they arrived at the hospital, the same sliding doors she had walked through so many times opened with an urgency she had never experienced. Nurses hurried alongside the stretcher, adjusting tubes and leads. guiding her into a brightly lit room where machines waited with cold, precise vigilance. Her consciousness wavered again. She saw her daughter's face appear in the doorway, pale, frightened, unsteady. Behind her, her son arrived, breathless, running a hand through his hair with nervous force. Their expressions were a mirror of their shock, their worry, their sudden confrontation with the vulnerability they had always insisted she did not have. And in a final moment of blurred clarity, Helena wondered if any of them had even thought to call Daniel. The thought cut through her just before darkness took the edges of her vision. Because even as her heart struggled, even as fear pressed against her ribs, one truth remained. The person who had always noticed her, truly noticed her, was the one they had dismissed. And now, in the hour she needed someone most, she did not know if he even knew she was here. The hospital waiting room had always seemed busy to Helena during her routine visits, but tonight it felt like another world entirely, a world she drifted in and out of, suspended between consciousness and the muffled sounds of chaos around her. While she lay under the bright scrutiny of machines and medical hands, her family found themselves in a different space, one filled with fluorescent lighting, plastic chairs, and a silence that swallowed every attempt at conversation. Her daughter paced in small, tight circles, arms crossed as though holding herself together by force. Her son sat rigidly in a corner chair, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as if the pattern on the tiles could offer answers. Their aunt tried intermittently to ask the nurse for updates, composing and recomposing questions in her mind before approaching the counter again, each time returning with the same uncertain expression. Fear had descended on them abruptly, stripping them of the certainty with which they had judged Helena for months. Now they waited, powerless, exposed, forced to face the possibility that they had misunderstood the woman they thought they knew so well. It was in the midst of this restless atmosphere that Daniel arrived. He entered quietly, not rushing, but with a clear purpose in every movement. His clothes still bore traces of his shift, faint creases from long hours, the subtle scent of antiseptic clinging to him. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had left work in a hurry the moment he received the call from Helena's daughter. The nurse at the front desk looked up and recognized him immediately, greeting him not as an intruder, but as someone who belonged in these corridors. Her daughter noticed him next. She froze mid-step, eyes widening with an expression that blended confusion and discomfort. The last time she had spoken his name aloud, it had been with skepticism. Now he stood here, grounded and steady, in a moment when their usual certainty had dissolved into fear. Daniel approached the small group without hesitation. He did not ask permission. He did not apologize for arriving. He simply asked, with a quiet firmness that surprised them, "Where is she?" His voice carried none of the insecurity they had once imagined in him. There was only concern, layered with an unmistakable depth of emotion. Helena's children exchanged glances, startled, perhaps even ashamed, but they pointed toward the double doors leading to the restricted area. "She's undergoing tests," her son muttered, avoiding Daniel's gaze. "They haven't told us much." Daniel nodded, absorbing the information. He didn't linger in the discomfort of their reactions. Instead, he walked straight to the nurse's counter and began speaking with a colleague who recognized him immediately. Their exchange was brief but professional. He asked specific questions, using terminology that Helena's family could not follow. The nurse responded with clarity, her trust in him evident. When he returned to the waiting area, he carried more information than any of them had managed to obtain in the last half hour. "They're stabilizing her," he said gently. "They're monitoring her heart rhythm. The next few hours are important, but she's receiving everything she needs." His words did not dramatize, did not minimize. They simply offered truth, the kind that steadied rather than frightened. He sat down, resting his forearms on his knees, exhaling a breath he had likely been holding since he received the call. In that moment, the entire room seemed to shift slightly around him. It was not dramatic, but palpable, a rearranging of assumptions. Her daughter observed him for a long moment, seeing something she had never allowed herself to see before. The way his presence calmed the space, the way he held himself with quiet authority. the way he seemed entirely focused on Helena, instead of on how others perceived him. Her son cleared his throat awkwardly. You came fast." Daniel looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "She's important to me," he replied simply. There was no defensiveness in his voice. No plea for acceptance. Just truth. The words struck deeper than any speech could have. Her children exchanged another glance. This one softer, heavier with reality. None of them had expected him to arrive. None of them had considered that he would stop everything just to be here, waiting, worrying, anchoring the fear that none of them knew how to manage. Daniel continued to sit with them, not imposing himself, but not distancing either. He answered their hesitant questions calmly, offering clarity where he could. When her daughter began to tremble slightly, the shock of helplessness settling in, Daniel moved closer, offering her a seat and a moment to breathe. She accepted without protest. Minutes stretched into an hour. The waiting room gradually emptied and refilled, a constant turnover of strangers living parallel anxieties. Through it all, Daniel remained steady, his presence a quiet force beside Helena's family. His hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the corridor door, his posture unwavering even as fatigue seeped into his expression. For the first time, her family saw not the imagined version of him, the one they had built from assumptions, fears, and projections, but the truth of who he was when no one else was watching. And as the clock crept past midnight, a realization began to take root in each of them, one they were not ready to say aloud. They had judged him without ever knowing him. And now, confronted with the reality of his unwavering devotion, they could not unsee what had been revealed. The hours after midnight moved slowly, as though time itself hesitated to cross into morning. The hospital lights remained bright and indifferent, casting long shadows against the walls, turning every expression into something sharper, more exposed. Helena's family sat scattered across the waiting area, fatigue pulling at their shoulders, conversations replaced by quiet sighs and anxious glances toward the hallway. Daniel, however, remained composed. He sat upright, not slumped in exhaustion, but grounded, a quiet pillar in a room full of fraying nerves. Occasionally, he would rise to speak with a nurse he recognized, gathering updates with a professionalism that earned him instant respect. He returned with calm, measured explanations, translating medical terms into something her family could understand. He did not raise his voice, did not dramatize, did not make himself the center of anything. He simply helped. Her daughter watched him closely, trying to reconcile the man before her with the man she had crafted in her warnings and worries. He did not fit the shape of her fears. He did not behave like someone taking advantage of her mother. Instead, he sat with patience, with commitment, with a sincerity that made her chest tighten in unexpected ways. At one point, a nurse approached with a clipboard, asking Helena's daughter to confirm insurance information and sign a few forms. She stood, shoulders tense, hands shaking slightly. Before she reached the counter, Daniel rose and joined her, gently guiding her through the paperwork without taking control, explaining each section as though he had done this dozens of times. Because he had. Her daughter's voice cracked when she thanked him. She wasn't used to gratitude in his direction, but Daniel simply nodded, accepting her words with a softness that made the moment feel heavier than she expected. When they returned to their seats, her son spoke up, his voice low. "You know how to do all that." Daniel met his gaze without any trace of superiority. "It's part of my work, and I care about her. So it's natural." Natural. The word hung between them, soft and undeniable. Her son looked away, unable to hold on to the certainty of his previous judgments. Later, when Helena's sister tried to insist that Daniel should descansar un poco, perhaps go home and return in the morning, he responded with a quiet firmness. "I'm staying." Not confrontational, not dramatic, simply final, a truth spoken without apology. And something in her expression shifted, a small crack in the rigid wall she had built around her assumptions. The waiting area grew quieter as the night deepened. A janitor pushed a mop across the tiled floor with slow, steady movements. A man in the corner prayed silently. A nurse passed by with a stack of charts. Each person existed in their own pocket of worry, and yet Daniel carried himself with a steadiness that seemed to create a gravitational center wherever he stood. Her daughter sat beside him again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to come." He looked at her with gentle clarity. "I care about her. I'm here because she shouldn't go through this alone." The words landed softly, but their impact rippled through her chest. She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening in the harsh hospital lighting. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy with recognition. Across the room, Helena's son watched the exchange, his brow furrowed in contemplation. He had always been the most protective, the quickest to judge. But now he saw a man who wasn't asking for permission to care, wasn't trying to prove anything, wasn't performing devotion. He simply lived it. As they waited, another update arrived. Helena was stabilized, but would remain under observation until morning. Relief washed through the group in visible waves. Her daughter wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her son pressed his palms together in a quiet gesture of gratitude, and her sister let out a breath she had been holding for too long. Daniel listened carefully, asking specific questions that none of the others would have thought to ask, about medication adjustments, monitoring intervals, potential risks. The nurse responded with respect, recognizing him as both a colleague and someone deeply invested in the patient's well-being. When the nurse left, a soft silence settled around the group. This time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. Her daughter spoke first, her voice almost a whisper. "We didn't know. We didn't see how you—" Daniel interrupted gently, not with rudeness, but with compassion. "You love her. You worry about her. That's enough." But they knew it wasn't enough. Not when worry had turned into judgment, when love had been twisted into control, when assumptions had blinded them to the reality of the man in front of them. Daniel leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes briefly, exhaustion finally sinking into him. Yet even tired, he radiated a calm that made the others feel steadier. And for the first time, Helena's family felt something they had not expected to feel toward him. Gratitude. Not spoken loudly, not declared dramatically, but present, unmistakably, in the quiet way they now watched him. Because in their mother's most fragile hour, when everything felt uncertain, trust had arrived in the form of the very man they had refused to understand. And now, sitting in the stillness of the hospital night, they could no longer deny what had become undeniable. He cared for her, truly, deeply, patiently, and the silence in the room had shifted, not hostile, but humbled. The morning arrived slowly, filtering into the hospital through pale bands of light that stretched across the floor like hesitant promises. Helena drifted in and out of sleep, her body reminding her of its fragility with every subtle ache and tight breath. Machines beside her emitted steady beeps, their rhythms both comforting and unsettling. She felt suspended between exhaustion and awareness, caught in a space where time didn't follow its usual rules. When she finally opened her eyes fully, she saw Daniel sitting at her bedside. He wasn't dozing or distracted. He sat upright, elbows resting gently on his knees, watching her with a quiet concentration that softened the sharp edges of the sterile room. His face was drawn with fatigue, but his expression held no regret about being there. It was as if he had anchored himself beside her through the entire night. "Bom dia," he said softly, though what mattered was not the greeting, but the way his voice wrapped itself around her like warmth. She wanted to smile, but her chest felt heavy, as if something inside her had shifted during the night. She tried to speak, but the first attempt came out as a whisper. When she finally managed to form a few words, she asked the question that had been pressing against the walls of her mind since she felt her body betray her. "What's happening to me?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Not because he wanted to hide anything, but because he wanted to choose words that respected both the truth and her vulnerability. He reached for her hand, not dramatically, not as a gesture of reassurance meant to impress her family, but simply because it was instinctive. "There's nothing immediately life-threatening," he said carefully, "but your tests show that your heart needs attention. Stress, exhaustion, maybe something evolving beneath the surface. The doctors want to monitor you closely." The words hovered in the air, neither catastrophic nor comforting, simply real. Helena felt a chill pass through her, not from fear alone, but from the sudden clarity that no amount of silence or pride could push this away. Her body had spoken loudly, and now she had to listen. Her daughter entered the room quietly, her eyes swollen from lack of sleep. Behind her came Helena's son and sister, each carrying different shades of worry on their faces. They approached the bed slowly, as though afraid to disturb the fragile balance of the moment. For a few breaths, the room felt like a gathering of hearts that had been cracked open overnight. Her daughter took a step closer. "Mom, you scared us." Helena wanted to say she had scared herself too. She wanted to apologize for the fear she had caused. But the words stuck, caught between her desire to comfort them and the weight of her own vulnerability. Daniel, sensing her fatigue, shifted slightly to make room for her family. He didn't leave, but he didn't dominate the space either. He understood, with a precision they had never credited him for, how to exist without overshadowing. The doctor entered shortly after, holding a clipboard and wearing an expression shaped by years of delivering complicated truths. He explained Helena's condition with professional clarity: arrhythmia episodes, elevated blood pressure, signs of a heart under strain. Nothing irreversible, but nothing insignificant. Lifestyle adjustments, follow-up exams, close monitoring. These became the pillars of the future she would need to navigate. Her family listened with wide eyes, asking questions in hurried tones. Daniel listened too, but his questions were different, more precise, more technical, more grounded in experience. The doctor responded to him with a level of detail reserved for colleagues. And Helena's children noticed, perhaps for the first time, how deeply Daniel understood not only her health, but the system she was now entangled in. When the doctor left, silence settled again. It was her son who broke it. He rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit from childhood. "Mom, we should have realized you weren't okay." The admission carried weight. Regret, recognition, maybe even guilt. Helena swallowed hard. She didn't want their remorse, not because it was unwelcome, but because emotion cost her energy she didn't have. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing slowly, opening them again only when she felt Daniel's thumb press gently against her hand in a silent grounding gesture. Her daughter looked at Daniel then, really looked at him. Not through the filter of her fears or biases, but through the truth of what she had witnessed during the night. "You stayed the whole time," she whispered. Daniel nodded, not seeking praise. She wasn't alone. That's what matters. The simplicity of the statement cut through the noise of their assumptions. Her daughter's eyes softened, her son exhaled deeply, and her sister lowered her gaze, swallowing the sting of her own misjudgments. For the first time, no one questioned the legitimacy of Daniel's presence. The doctor returned later with updated test results. Helena could leave soon, but only with strict precautions. Medication, follow-ups, rest. A new chapter of awareness. Helena listened, absorbing the reality that her body had crossed a threshold she could no longer ignore. She felt fear, yes, but also something gentler, something steady. Because when she looked to her left, Daniel was there. When she looked to her right, her family, shaken, humbled, stood differently than before. As the doctor left again, Helena breathed slowly, aware of the fragile line between past and future. Her world had tilted, but it had not collapsed. And now there were truths no one in that room could unknow. She was vulnerable. Daniel was devoted. And their judgments had been built on shadows rather than reality. The day had softened into late afternoon by the time Helena was moved to a quieter observation room, where the light filtered in through sheer curtains, casting flickering patterns across the floor. The turbulence of the night had settled, leaving behind a quiet hum of exhaustion that clung to everyone who had kept vigil at her side. Her family remained nearby, scattered in chairs and leaning against walls, their bodies slack with fatigue but their eyes alert whenever someone approached the room. Daniel had not moved far from Helena's side. He didn't hover, didn't pace, didn't intrude. He simply remained, steady, present, rooted in a calm that seemed to fill the room like oxygen. Each time a nurse entered with charts or medication, Daniel rose slightly, not interfering but observing closely, absorbing every instruction with practiced attention. It was during one of these interactions, as a nurse explained the new schedule of medications, that Helena's daughter looked at him with a new expression, one shaped not by skepticism, but by dawning understanding. "You'll help her with all this?" she asked quietly. Daniel looked at her without hesitation. "Yes, whatever she needs." There was no self-importance in his tone, no attempt to impress, only certainty, the kind that comes from knowing one's place, not because it has been granted, but because it has been earned through action. Her daughter nodded slowly, the tension in her shoulders loosening as though she was allowing herself, for the first time, to trust him. Helena watched the exchange with tired eyes, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and emotion too deep for words. She wanted to speak, to bridge the gap between them, but her body reminded her again of its limits. Her breaths felt thin, fragile threads binding her to the moment. Later, when the room grew quieter and a nurse dimmed the lights, Daniel stepped outside for the first time to grab a cup of water. He didn't go far, barely down the hall. When he returned, Helena's family stood in a small cluster near her bed, speaking in hushed voices. They fell silent when he entered. Her son cleared his throat first. A gente nunca viu você assim." He gestured vaguely toward the corridor, toward everything Daniel had done through the night. "We misjudged you." The words weren't polished, but they were honest, and heavier because of it. Daniel didn't respond with a triumphant smile or a lecture about assumptions. He simply nodded, acknowledging the vulnerability it took for them to say it. "I understand why you worried," he replied. "She's precious to you. She's precious to me too." The quiet sincerity of his voice settled into their chests, diffusing whatever defensiveness remained. Helena, watching from the bed, felt tears prick her eyes. She had imagined a moment like this, but never believed it would come without conflict, without her needing to defend or justify herself. Yet here it was, unfolding naturally, shaped not by argument, but by truth revealed in crisis. Her daughter stepped closer to the bed. "Mom, we saw how he stayed here all night, how he took care of everything. We saw." Helena opened her mouth to respond, but emotion tightened her throat. Daniel moved closer, resting a gentle hand on her arm, grounding her. Then, unexpectedly, he turned to her family with a quiet determination that filled the room. "I'd like to help with her recovery," he said. "With the medications, the follow-up appointments, whatever adjustments she needs at home. I want to be present. Not to replace anyone, but to stand with all of you." Her family stared at him in stunned silence. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a declaration meant to win approval. It was simply a statement of commitment. And yet, it carried the weight of something far deeper. An invitation, a request, a promise. The moment stretched, delicate and uncertain. It was her daughter who stepped forward first. She took a breath, steadying herself. "If that's what she wants, then we want it too." Her son nodded, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "She shouldn't go through this alone. If you're willing, we're willing." Helena felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with something luminous, something that shimmered beneath her ribs, expanding into warmth that softened even the pain. She looked at Daniel, whose eyes were fixed on her, not the others. He wasn't seeking their approval. He was seeking her consent. Her fingers moved slowly, brushing against his hand. It was all the answer he needed. And in that quiet hospital room, where machines hummed and shadows stretched long across the walls, something fragile and profound shifted. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but irrevocably. The people who had tried to push him away were now opening the door. The man they had doubted was now the one they trusted. And the woman who had spent months torn between love and fear found herself surrounded, not by judgment, but by a fragile, growing acceptance. The request Daniel had made was simple, understated, almost ordinary. But for everyone in the room, it marked the beginning of something entirely new. A future no longer divided. A future in which love did not need to apologize. Helena felt the world move differently around her as she was wheeled toward the hospital exit. Not slower. She had known slow, but gentler, as though everything had learned to step carefully around her newly tender edges. The air outside the sliding doors was cool and carried a faint scent of sea salt drifting in from the coast. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the breeze brush against her face like a blessing she hadn't known she needed. Her daughter walked on one side of the wheelchair, her son on the other. Daniel pushed from behind, his steps steady, unhurried. The quiet between them wasn't tense anymore. It was thoughtful, softened. A kind of silence shaped by everything they had witnessed together during the long night and the still longer morning. Once outside, Daniel helped her into the car with a care that felt instinctive, not performative. His hands supported her without making her feel helpless. He stood close enough to steady her, but not close enough to take her agency. It was a delicate balance he seemed to understand intuitively. Her daughter watched him closely, noting the small gestures she had dismissed before, the way he anticipated Helena's movements, the way he adjusted the seatbelt gently so it wouldn't press against her chest, the way he asked nothing of her except to breathe and rest. Even her son, usually more guarded, lingered near the open car door longer than necessary, as if trying to decipher what had always been in plain sight. Driving home, the city passed by in soft blurs of color. Pale storefronts, narrow streets, the faint shimmer of sunlight over the ocean. Helena leaned her head back against the seat, feeling the nudge of fatigue settling deep into her bones. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. It felt honest, like her body asking for kindness rather than apology. Her children spoke quietly in the front seats, murmuring words she couldn't quite catch. But she knew the tone. Concern without accusation, reflection without superiority. Something had shifted in them, something she had silently hoped for, but never dared expect. When they arrived at her apartment, the familiar hallway felt different, as though washed in new light. Her daughter unlocked the door and stepped aside. Her son carried her bag. Daniel supported her elbow with a gentleness that steadied every step. The apartment smelled faintly of lavender from the diffuser she often forgot to refill. The air felt lived in, safe, waiting. Once inside, Helena sat on the sofa with a soft exhale. Her daughter immediately began tidying, folding blankets, adjusting cushions, opening windows. Her son checked the kitchen, muttering something about reorganizing things so she wouldn't have to reach up high. They moved with a kind of quiet urgency, as if making up for all the moments they hadn't truly seen her. And Daniel stood nearby, hands resting lightly on the back of an armchair, watching her with steady, warm concern. When her children were done fussing, they joined her in the living room. For the first time in months, there was no tension coiled between them, no unspoken judgment ready to slip into conversation. Just presence. Simple, honest. Her daughter sat beside her. "Mummy, we were wrong." Helena blinked, absorbing the weight of the words. "We didn't understand," her daughter continued, her voice trembling slightly. "We judged before we saw, before we even tried to see." Her son nodded. He was there every second, more than any of us could have been. And not because he had to, because he wanted to. Helena's eyes softened, but before she could speak, Daniel stepped forward. Not to take the moment, but to share it. "You love her," he said gently to her children. "You've always loved her. That's why you worried." He exhaled, slow and sincere. "I don't blame you. I never did." Her daughter lowered her gaze, tears gathering along her lashes. "We thought you were going to hurt her." Daniel shook his head, not at the accusation, but at the sadness behind it. "She means too much for me to ever take her for granted." The simplicity of the truth made Helena's throat tighten. She reached for his hand. It felt warm, grounding, the one constant through the uncertainty of the past hours. Her daughter watched the gesture with a softness Helena had never seen before, an acceptance shaped not by resignation, but by understanding. They spent the rest of the afternoon in gentle conversation, talking about medications, schedules, plans for the coming weeks. Her son promised to visit more often. Her daughter insisted on driving her to appointments, but neither spoke from a place of control or suspicion. Their offers came from love, real love, the kind that listens instead of directing. As the sun dipped lower, casting long golden beams across the living room floor, Helena felt something inside her settle. Not the certainty that everything would be easy, but the certainty that she was not alone in any of it. Not misunderstood, not dismissed, seen. Later, when her children finally left, Daniel stayed behind to brew her tea. The soft clatter of the kettle, the smell of chamomile, the warmth of the cup in her hands, everything felt grounded, present. He sat beside her, not speaking, just resting his hand over hers. When she looked at him, she saw not the boy her family had imagined, not the outsider they had tried to keep at a distance, but the man who had stayed through the storm, steady and unwavering. Outside, the evening deepened. Inside, calm settled like a blanket over her shoulders. And in that quiet, illuminated by the soft glow of the fading day, Helena understood that the most profound shift of all had not been in her family's perspective, but in her own heart. The day their eyes changed was also the day she realized she never needed permission to be loved the way she was.